Hello, and welcome to your lecture on imperialism and nation-state formation. In specific, this lecture is going to be looking at Russian and American imperialism. 5.2 states that imperialism influenced state formation and contraction around the world, and D specifically wants you to look at the United States and Russian imperialism, which copied what the Europeans were doing in regards to transoceanic imperialism. And so you need to make sure that you understand what territories they were taking over and how they managed to gain those territories. We're going to look at America first, and one of the most important areas that the Americans are going to gain during this time period is control over the Philippines. The United States gained the Philippines from the Spanish during the SpanishAmerican War. The SpanishAmerican War starts basically the USS Maine blew up, and the United States said that it was the Spanish forces that blew it up, and so that justified us going into war with them. One of the reasons why the Americans were wanting to challenge the Spanish in this war was to gain territory throughout the Pacific Islands and down into the Caribbean. And this war is going to provide a lot of new land for them as a result of the treaty that ends it in 1898. The term Filipino was actually used to refer to Creoles who were born there. So these are Spanish born people, ethnic people who were born in the islands on the Philippines. And the Filipinos are actually going to develop a huge nationalism as a result of this change of hands between the Spanish and the Americans. The Filipinos actually declared their independence from Spain on June 12th in 1898, but Spain gave the Philippines to the United States on April 11th, 1899, as a result of the Spanish-American War. So the United States is going to go in and basically reoccupy what was an independent Philippines, but it was only independent for a couple months. As a result, we end up with what in the U.S. history we call the PhilippineAmerican War. We've also called this the Philippine Insurrection. In Philippine history, they actually teach it as the Philippine independence movement. So obviously, you can discuss the idea of point of view and bias in regards to writing history and how this event or this time period is named. The Filipinos were in no way ready to defend themselves against the American advanced weaponry. So they were not able to fight effectively against the Americans. And so the number of Filipino casualties is somewhat unknown and controversial. So there's been reports, the U.S. reports that there were only 34,000 casualties. Some Filipino reports go up to 220,000 casualties. So the number of Filipinos who were killed as a result of this war between the Filipinos and the Americans is completely unknown in a real sense. A couple things that the Americans are going to do while they occupy the Philippines is they disestablish the Catholic Church and they force English as the official language on the Filipinos. So that's why you have a lot of your Filipino friends are actually going to be Catholic. They also oftentimes have Spanish-sounding last names is because of Spanish control. And then the Americans are going to ultimately stop fighting the Filipinos in 1913 due to the advent of World War I, and then they will lose control of it as a result of the Japanese occupying it, and then the U.S. troops will ultimately liberate the Philippine island from the Japanese in 1944. So the true Filipino independence is not actually achieved until the post-World War II era. Other territories that we're going to gain as a result of the Spanish-American War is Guam, Samoa, and Midway. These are all islands. Guam is all about a port for the U.S. Navy. It's an important port of call in regards to crossing the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is a lot bigger than the Atlantic, and so you have to have these islands where you can refuel, gain food, restock, and things of that nature, and that's why we wanted Guam. Guam today actually holds one of our Navy bases. Samoa and Midway is a midway point. Basically, Midway is called Midway because it's between the U.S. or the North America and the Pacific. And the Americans took over these two islands in 1867, even before the Spanish-American War. As a result of the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris that ends the Spanish-American War, Samoa is going to be divided between Germany and the United States. And again, this is all about just gaining Pacific holdings in regards to Navy. At this point, at the turn of the century, people were getting a little nervous about Japan. And so a lot of countries started to kind of establish these little island bases out in the Pacific. They are going to be important for American trade as well as to American defense. In the United States, we were involved in China. Not as on a large scale as what the Europeans were doing, but we definitely were there. So throughout the 1850s, the European powers had created these spheres of influence where they had special privileges in what we geographically call China today. The U.S. didn't have anything like that in China. The United States had been trading with China for quite some time, and what ends up happening is we start to create this idea, this open door policy. The Secretary of State, John Hay, says that they wanted to give equal trading rights to all foreign nations in China. So all of those unequal treaties that were being created between the European nations and China, basically the United States wanted all of those rights to be extended to the United States as well. What he did was they wrote up this open door policy. They sent out the open door policy to all of the major powers throughout the world, and it became fact for China. China didn't really have an opportunity to argue this or to counter this. So basically all the open door policy is an extension of the unequal treaties into the U.S. as well. The Boxer Rebellion is going to somewhat be a direct result of the open door policy. The Boxers were a group of citizens in China who were opposed to any foreign influence in China. They were done with the foreign influence that was in this geographical area we call China today. And so the Boxer Rebellion ends up causing quite a problem for the Qing dynasty. The biggest problem is that the Boxers, unlike the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxers were targeting foreigners. And so the U.S., Germany, Russia, France, Great Britain all sends in this international army to take out the rebellion. The Qing didn't even have to fight it. The Qing don't even really get heavily involved in this. And they basically, we come out with a policy that says that nobody can directly control China, because there's an opportunity here for other foreign armies to kind of take direct control of China and even overthrow the Qing dynasty. The United States says, we're not doing that. You can't do that. But what you can do is end this rebellion so that we can continue our economic control of the Chinese state. In the Caribbean, there's interest in the Caribbean for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is to protect our hemisphere. The U.S. wanted to keep foreign powers out of the Caribbean because we didn't want any foreign powers, any European powers, to have any holdings in the Caribbean anymore. And in fact, President Monroe releases a doctrine that says, like, this is our hemisphere, we're in charge of it. Europe, you need to stay out. Also, obviously, there's huge economic interest in this area, especially for sugar, and we want to, and fruits, and those kinds of things. And so we want to make sure that we are going to continue with that economic relationship with the Caribbean. And if European powers came in and took over those island groups, we would lose out economically, and so we want to make sure that we are still controlling that area as well. One of our biggest reasons is that we needed a canal. We wanted to build a canal so that we could get Navy, shipping, commerce to go from the East Coast to the West Coast and the West Coast to the East Coast super easy. And so what we end up doing is we help Panama become an independent country from Colombia, and then we fund the building of the Panama Canal. And as a result of that, we will basically indirectly control Panama because of our interest in the canal. Puerto Rico we gained as a result of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. government establishes a civil government in Puerto Rico, so we actually help Puerto Rico set up their own government system. And so they have a governor, there's an upper house of delegates and a lower house of delegates. the upper house is set up where the delegates in the upper house are picked by the president and then approved by Congress. Then the lower house is elected by popular vote of Puerto Ricans. Those born in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens, and this is Puerto Rico is still a territory. Their economy is closely tied to the United States, and basically they could not necessarily gain their independence, but they don't want to become American in regards to preserving their Puerto Rican culture, and there have been several votes in the past on whether Puerto Rico should become a state or not, and it's continuously been the Puerto Ricans say no. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean, and so of course we want to kind of control it, and it's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so we end up making it a protectorate as a result of the Americans at the Spanish-American War. And so what we end up doing is American businesses invest crazy heavy money into Cuba, and the Cuban government has to agree to what's called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment says that the U.S. has the right to intervene in Cuban affairs at any time. This is overturned in 1930, which will kind of result in what will become the Cuban Revolution, which we'll talk about in the next unit. Going back to Panama, Teddy Roosevelt is the one who kind of struck the deal with the Panamanians to create a revolt to help them win their independence. And we also sent down military support, and we're the first to recognize Panama as a new country, of course. And in return, Panama gives the U.S. complete control of a 10-mile strip of rainforest through Panama, which is called the Canal Zone, and that's where we will build the Panama Canal. A couple other policies, we've already mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued in 1823. The Roosevelt Corollary, this is under Teddy Roosevelt. It's known as Big Stick Policy. Basically, Teddy Roosevelt said you walk softly but carry a big stick. In other words, the U.S. is going to be kind of like this international police power in Latin American affairs. And so through the Roosevelt Corollary, we are declaring to Latin America, hey, we're going to be involved in your politics, your economy, and that will continue on up until really the 80s. We have a lot of active 1980s. We have a lot of activity going on in Latin America, and again, we'll talk about a lot of those details in the next unit. And a lot of times when we go into these territories, Haiti, Nicaragua, Honduras, Dominican Republic, a lot of the West Indies, we send troops into these regions quite often, and we're using the Roosevelt Corollary as our justification for doing that. Latin Americans don't like it. Latin Americans feel that American intervention has oftentimes created more problems for them, and again, we'll look at specific instances really in the next unit. Taft created this thing called dollar diplomacy, where basically we're going to encourage people to invest in Caribbean countries. Dollar diplomacy is American investments were used to promote American foreign policy goals. So in other words, we're going to support something like the United Fruit Company being setting up a farm base in Guatemala so that we can control the Guatemalan's government, which we ultimately do. If the Latin Americans don't repay loans on time, then U.S. troops were sent in to ensure payment. So basically we're establishing ourselves as a military power in Latin America. President Wilson actually kind of changed the American policies towards Latin America, but he ends up countering his goal by sending in troops to Haiti, Nicaragua, and Dominican Republic, and then he purchases the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917. So even though he said he wanted to lessen American involvement in Latin America, he actually increases it. One of the biggest things for the United States is we decided that it was our manifest destiny to get from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And so after the American Revolution, we gain all the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River as part of our negotiations with the British. In 1803, it will be the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, and obviously we have Lewis and Clark, who goes out with Sacagawea and does the surveying and all that kind of stuff, where we learn about this land and what we can do with it. We will actually do a lot of propagandist advertising in places like Ireland and Germany to encourage small farmers to come to the United States and come into Oklahoma territory and establish these great farms. which we did, which a lot of immigrants actually responded to. And you can see a little bit of our propaganda there, the idea of Lady Liberty walking across and how prosperous it will be and how fantastic it will be. And notice the right side is light and the left side of the painting is dark. So America will bring the light into the West Coast. There were people living in these areas, and the way that we deal with it was through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This is where actually the Seminoles moved to Florida, and this creates the Trail of Tears. This is under President Jackson. The Trail of Tears is where thousands of Native Americans die as they are pushed to the Oklahoma Territory. We do have a couple of battles with Native Americans as they were trying to kind of reestablish themselves and control their own land. One of them is Little Bighorn in 1876, which Custer actually lost, despite Americans having better weapons. This is a huge embarrassment for the United States, and actually gives a little bit of motivation for the Native Americans to continue to challenge the United States government. Wounded Knee was actually a battle that was an accident. In 1890, a Sioux man shot off a gun at night, and over 200 Native Americans were killed as a result of that. So the treatment of the Native Americans by the United States is obviously something that is controversial. The term genocide sometimes is thrown around to describe things like the Trail of Tears and Wounded Knee. If you have seen the movie Dances with Wolves, it kind of shows how we had Americans kind of sitting close to reservations so that we could monitor what the Native Americans were doing, and we definitely wanted to create control of these Native populations. Here's a map of the Trail of Tears. You had two options. You could take a land route or a water route by utilizing the Mississippi River. And again, thousands of people died along the route as a result of the harsh conditions as they were traveling. Another huge amount of land that we gained was through the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War really kind of starts with Texas. Texas was a territory that had gained independence from Mexico in 1836. The United States wanted Texas to be part of, which was actually where the Alamo and all of that came in. The Alamo was a battle that the Texans lost against the Mexicans, and then they will ultimately, under the General Sam Houston, will be successful against the Mexicans in 1836. In 1845, the United States annexes Texas, and the Mexicans start to, basically the borderline starts to get fuzzy, and that's when Mexico responds. Mexico loses the Spanish-American War, or the Mexican-American War, and as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. is going to gain half of Mexico's territory and $15 million. So we even make the Mexicans pay us for the war. So this is where we get the Rio Grande as our border between Mexico and the United States. So this is the painting that depicts the Alamo. This is where the Mexicans are successful against the Texans, and then remember, the Alamo is the battle cry for the next battles where the Texans are going to be successful. Here's the territory changes that kind of give you an idea of what was going on in regards to the territories that were being disputed between Texas, Mexico, and ultimately the U.S. government. And it just so happened that as we get California in 1848, we find a lot of gold in 1849, which allowed for a huge amount of populations to start to go out into California. Moving on to Russia. Here is a map that kind of shows you where Russia was gaining territory and when they gained it, and the different czars that were associated with it. So in 1533 is the brown area, so that's under the Ivans. You can see some of the gray area, and some of the red area is leading into the Romanovs. Peter the Great ruled until the mid-1700s, and then you have Catherine the Great, who is actually going to gain control of a lot of access to the Black Sea. She fought the Turks quite a bit, and then your Nicholases and your Alexanders continue to expand. In order to gain access to the Black and Caspian Seas, which we call the Caucus Regions, the Ottomans are the Russians are going to have to fight the Ottoman Turks. So when the Ottomans failed to take Vienna in 1689, Russia joins an alliance with Austria, Poland, and Venice to push the Ottomans south. Remember that economic relationship that the Ottomans have with Venice? Well, at that point it had become unfavorable to Venice, and so they wanted to fight on the side of the Russians. What they're looking for is to gain this Caucus region that modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are the states that control that region now, and the Black Sea, and then the Caspian Sea. There were several Russo-Turkish wars between different czars like Catherine the Great that ultimately led to the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula into Russia in 1783. On the map to the right, you'll see the Crimean Peninsula circled. Technically, the Crimean Peninsula is attached to the Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula, as you can see, is super important in regards to trade and refueling and things of that nature. The Ukraine is also going to be an important part to Russian imperialism as well. Into Europe, basically Russia is going to gain territory through the 7 Years' War and then a series of partitioning of Poland. So in the 7 Years' War, Russia allies with France and Austria, and they gain a bunch of territory on the Baltic. So the Baltic Sea is the sea between, like, at the northern area where today you have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And so Russia gains a lot of that territory on that area. And then with Poland, there's 3 official splits of Poland where ultimately by 1795 Poland doesn't exist anymore. So Russia, Prussia, and Austria are going to split Poland up amongst the 3 of them, and you can see the different territories that each state gained with the 3 different partitions. So what Russia was gaining was in purple. What Prussia was gaining, Prussia will ultimately become Germany, is in blue, and then what Austria was gaining was in green. Into Central Asia, kind of our Stan area, most of these culture groups in this region were nomads, and they're not going to survive against Russian gunpowder weapons. So what the Russians did is they built forts along these blue lines around the Aral Sea, and as they built these forts, they basically end up just kind of controlling the nomads. Again, the term genocide is used a little bit here when talking about all these nomadic groups, and Russia will continue to basically control this Central Asian territory. And since these were not states, they were just nomadic groups, it's all a bunch of individual battles as they defeated like tribe after tribe after tribe. As we get into Asia, one of the things about Siberia, at first, the czars were just collecting tribute from the people in Siberia through fur, and ultimately, eventually, they become economically reliant on Russia, and eventually Russia will just kind of directly control that territory. Russia does reach the Pacific Ocean in 1639. They take out a Mongolian Khanate that was still in existence over there. And one of the things that helped was smallpox. This is very like Cortez and the Spanish in the New World. They killed a lot of the natives that were in the region through both smallpox and through just military. And so they're going to continue to kind of spread out to the Pacific Ocean. The Qing were super weak because of internal rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, and so the Russians started to enforce treaties on them, just unequal treaties, just like what the British were doing, to expand their control into the northern territories. And we will actually end up with a treaty between China and Russia that sets the Russian border along the Amur River. So here you can see where the Amur River is circled. Another important thing to understand is the city of Vladivostok. The city of Vladivostok is going to be super important in regards to dealing with Japan. You can see that now Russia has access to the Pacific and to the Sea of Japan. This is going to interrupt new Meiji industrialization and trade. And so we will end up with fighting between the Japanese and the Russians and what's called the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. One of the most important things that was integral to Russian imperialism is the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway. These lines are the current rail lines that were ultimately built. One thing I want to point out is the lake between the Green Line and the Red Line towards China, Mongolia. Lake Baikal is the largest freshwater lake in the world. They were unable to build a bridge across the lake, and so instead they went around the lake. One of the things about the Russo-Japanese War is the Russians didn't have troops out in Vladivostok and out in that region, and so when Japan attacked, Russia had to quickly get their troops across the Trans-Siberian Railway. They got stuck at Lake Baikal. These two lines were not built, and so by the time Russia got out there, the Russian troops got out there, Japan had completely taken over and had completely won. This is a huge deal because Russia is the state who's expanding and becoming important throughout this era. They're industrializing quickly. They got the railway. They are taking out Poland. They have massive alliances. They are also the only ones who are successful against Napoleon. So the attitude toward Russia as being a European power during this era is hugely important. Then, in 1905, all of a sudden, the Tsar can't defeat Japan. That makes no sense to Europe. And that's when the attitude towards the Japanese starts to change. That's why the United States was starting to think about Japan. That's why the world started to look at Japan as a power. It's because they were able to defeat almighty Russia. And also, there's some internal issues with that. The citizens of Russia all of a sudden lost a war. That kind of freaks them out, which helps aid in what will become the Communist Revolution in 1917. Here's just a map that shows you the territory that they were fighting over between the Russians and the Japanese. So at this point, Japan has already controlled Korea. And so you can see Japan is going to gain all of this territory from Russia, which is just going to aid Japanese invasion into China. And Japanese invasion into China starts really with this time period, but into World War I. While Europe is distracted by fighting each other with World War I, Japan is literally just marching across China because all of the European powers are pulling their troops out of China to go fight World War I. So Japan just kind of watched Europe take each other out and continue to gain more and more and more power and expand into China. After World War I, we tell Japan, we meaning the United States, tells Japan to get out of China. You're not allowed to imperialize anymore. You're not allowed to have these colonies in China. You need to leave. Japan said, try to make us, and that's what will end up creating World War II. I hope you enjoyed your lecture. I hope you're starting to see some of the what's going to happen into the next era, and that there's massive connections between this time period and the next time period, creating both World War I and World War II.